bikum for IFAB Online.
Welcome to IFAB Online.
欢迎你到 IFAB Online.
Welcome to this session on IFAB Online, which is focusing on fundraising from Asia in the MENA region. My name is Dave Shepherd. I've recently returned to the UK after having spent 27 years in Asia, based in Singapore, working at an international school where for the last 14 years I set up their advancement office and fundraising alumni relations. But the real stars of today's show are Naila and Gawa, and they are going to give you their perspectives from fundraising from an Asian perspective in the Middle East region and what it is like to be in the Middle East region when fundraising is being attempted there. So without further ado, I'm going to let the two panelists introduce themselves. I'll give you a little bit of background about who they are and what they've done, and then we'll move into the main presentation after that. So Naila, would you like to introduce yourself first, and then we'll move on to Gaga.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So I'm Naila Faruqi. I'm the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum, which is a membership-based association of Arab donors and funders working across the Arab region. And I'm currently based in Cairo, but my forum has members all over the Arab region and outside of the region as well. So anyone that's doing any kind of grant making and working in the philanthropy sector around the region is part of is welcome and eligible to be part of my membership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naila. And Gawa, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I am Gawa. I am the head of principal gifts at University College London. I have been asked to speak at this conference under the context of when I had been fundraising in China, which is mostly at the Allen Center for Contemporary Art, which is an art museum based in Beijing. That's me.
Thank you very much. So Gawa, if you could start please by explaining to the delegates your experiences of fundraising from an Asian context in the MENA region, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I got asked to speak at this conference and then got the brief of fundraising in the Middle East because I had some experience there and realized that I wasn't exactly necessarily that successful at fundraising from the MENA region. But I'll give you some background on it, and then I think we can take that journey together. At the Allen Center for Contemporary Art, it is an art museum, which is a non-for-profit center in Beijing. And it came about, I think, in 2005, where it previously had the funding from a philanthropist who then wanted us to diversify income and just become more sustainable, which meant that we needed to find donors, international and from China, in order to support the organization. Its philanthropy is relatively new in China. Increasingly, I think the Chinese have become wealthier, and we have created in recent years a culture of philanthropy, but it was always the government who was able to sustain the cultural sector in a really significant way. And so there had been a lot of challenges in understanding who the potential donors could be, how to set up the culture to support it, the governmental structures to support it, the mechanisms to steward them, cultivate them, what we were able to do, what we should be doing, what is best practice. And whilst I was at UCCA, we were right in the middle of all of that, trying to understand what the boundaries were. So why did we go to the Arab region? Why would an art museum ever go there in the first place? The answer was because at that time, and still, contemporary Chinese art was of such significant interest across the entirety of the world. The market values were going up. Ai Weiwei was in the news a lot, and a lot of the collectors of Chinese art were actually donors who currently lived in the Arab region and in the Middle East. And so we thought, because they were buying a lot of the works, they wanted to support the artists, that this would be a good conversation to be having. There were shared values, they're interested in supporting the ecosystem. This is time to go out to them. And so what it looked like was leveraging the networks of our various philanthropists who were based in China or based in Europe, who then had a presence there. It looked like going through cultural exchange, so governmental structures, through the schools, the universities. And it looked like us actually going there during the art fairs. Art Dubai is one of them. The Sharjah Biennial is another one. And just talking to as many people as we can to get the mission of the museum out there, which is to share as much contemporary Chinese art and international art with various international audiences as possible. Whether we were successful, I think, is a slightly different question, because we had so many different challenges and we were trying to build the ship as we sail it, build the plane as we fly it. I can't remember what the right phrase is. I think that there are a lot of things that we didn't necessarily think about before we sort of went into this. We just thought the audience is there, they have the interest, let's just go and do it. But really what we should have done is to think about where the shared objectives were with the audience that we had in place, to sort of frame our strategy and think about what the short-term gains were for it, the long-term gains were for it, the opportunities were to create dialogue, collaboration, what the buy-in would be for the audiences based in the Middle East to then fund the organization in China. What would they get out of giving the funds, not only in the first year, but the third year, the fifth year? I hadn't even thought really about what I meant, because the majority of my engagement was around the United Arab Emirates, and maybe a little bit in Sharjah, but it was just Dubai, that's Abu Dhabi, that's where we were going. And it was so short-sighted, I think, in that moment, because we were able to get some small donations towards specific exhibitions that had the artists from the Middle East, but the engagement was not really substantial, I think.
One of the things that I sort of was hearing from that as well is the shared values piece, but also creating your case for support for being in the region. Was that something that was focused on deliberately, or did you adapt that for working in the different region?
We saw the majority of our audiences, of the people who were collecting the art and wanting to talk to the artists, were from the region. But where they were actually from the region, in terms of that's their birthplace, that's where they culturally identify from, wasn't necessarily always the case. A lot of them were expatriates currently living in the region, and therefore we created that bridge. The case for support, it was built around their interest in supporting those specific artists. But it wasn't, and this is embarrassing to say, it was never really built around what then we could add as value for the donors or the philanthropists in their regions themselves. It was us going out and saying, how are you going to support us? Instead of us going to them and saying, how can we create this collaborative partnership where we elevate international art together? And so the level of sophistication at that time, which I would like to say was about 5 to 6 years ago at least, was just not there in any way.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Gal. Naila, you've obviously got extensive experience in the region. Could you maybe respond to some of those points that you've heard and give us an overview of the philanthropic landscape in the region? And I know specifically you'd like to start by defining region and the area. So we're looking forward to learning a lot about the grassroots opportunities and landscape in the MENA region, please.
Sure. Thanks for that, Gao. So unlike China, philanthropy in the Arab region, and to your point, Dave, so I am kind of careful not to say the Middle East, only because I always ask middle of where and east of whom, and the Middle East actually is a kind of a defining term that was used by the British to set to kind of cut up the region when they were figuring out who should take what. So it has a lot of kind of colonialist implications to it, and so I kind of I use the Arab region, and the definition of that is the perfect segue into the overview of the region. The Arab region, in addition to sharing language, which is the Arabic language, it comprises 22 Arab countries. which make up approximately anywhere between 390 to 400 million people. So geographically, it's a pretty significant kind of geography. It makes up about 10% of the world's countries, not population, but about 10% of the world's geography. The population of the Arab region is about 50% is under the age of 25. So it's a very kind of youth-heavy population with a lot of potential. And in terms of philanthropy being embedded, and that's where I was saying, unlike China, philanthropy is actually very much embedded in the Arab culture and is not new at all as a concept or as a behavior. And I don't know if Gao Gao meant, kind of what we consider the modern philanthropy versus just philanthropic giving as a cultural behavior. But in the Arab region, it's actually, it's been said that the oldest act of philanthropy in the world was actually considered to come from the region at the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, which is in Fez, Morocco. And it was a university founded in 859 AD by a woman, which is also noteworthy. And that university still stands today. So that's considered to be the oldest act of endowed philanthropy and kind of recorded philanthropy in the world. So, a lot of times when we're invited, myself or any of my peers from the region are invited to speak about, tell us about the emerging philanthropy in the Arab region, where we often find that a little bit funny, just because, for us, a lot of times we feel like we're pretty sure we started it. Not that it's a competition, but you know what I mean. It's very much embedded in the culture. It's very much embedded in our history. And so kind of, if we look at an overview of the different types of philanthropy in the region, we have the more traditional forms of Arab philanthropy, which include mostly religious giving. And so there are different types of religious giving, whether it's Islamic giving or Christian giving, which are, kind of the most prevalent. Waqf is one type of Islamic giving, which actually very loosely translates into an endowment. Zakat is another, which is alms or charitable giving, which is actually the third pillar of Islam, and is understood to be obligatory for believers. Sadaqah is another type of benevolence or voluntary giving, which differs from zakat in that it's not obligatory. And then we have other kind of Coptic Christian and Christian types of giving. Much of Arab philanthropy is thought to stem from religious giving. And that is kind of one of the foundational elements that sort of impacts and influences the way Arab giving and Arab philanthropy has progressed and is progressing. And more recently, we've seen more emerging trends in Arab philanthropy, which have included, more institutionalized family and corporate foundations, a trend towards support of more sustainable solutions, around, looking at social impact, social return on investments, looking at venture philanthropy. We've seen that, the top cause tends to be around achieving social change. And much of that was also highlighted in the 2011 and post-2011 kind of, uprisings and what we're calling the Arab Spring, although it seems to be evergreen. And then a lot of legacy or planned giving that differs a little bit from the more traditional sense in that it's a little bit more strategic. And my forum, for example, one of the strategies and strategic objectives of the Arab Foundations Forum is to work with our members, many of whom have been in the philanthropic sector for years and years, decades and decades, and have been very successful. But we've been looking more at how do we take these more traditional forms of philanthropy and try to infuse a little bit more strategy, a little bit more long-term giving, and looking at kind of the forensic accounting of what types of impact is our philanthropy making. So we know that the top motivation in the region still tends to be around religious faith. The top sectors tend to be health and social change. Health, social change, and that includes education. And then part of what sort of makes up one of our biggest challenges is that the geographic area where most Arab philanthropy is made is local mostly, and in some cases regional. So, even though there is a move beyond the traditional asks, even though there are opportunities for partnerships and, the region is going digital, has gone digital, in many cases has leapfrogged a lot of sort of the processes and the sequence of going digital. There are visibility opportunities for joint engagement with media, with other organizations globally. Our forum, for example, is a platform where Arab philanthropists and Arab philanthropy actors are able to engage on a global platform as well. So there are those opportunities. We have, events that can advocate and raise awareness, mostly outside of the region, not always within the region, because of another set of challenges, which I'll get to in a second. And then kind of the networking opportunities. And I often do a SWOT analysis that is kind of the, the good, the bad, and the ugly of Arab philanthropy across the region. And I'll sort of touch on that just very, briefly, if we can go through it just as a bit of a SWOT analysis. If we're looking at some of the strengths of Arab philanthropy, we know that there's a geopolitical transition across the region, which means that there's an increased awareness of what possibilities there are and what potential there is for further change. And the potential power of a strong, thriving civil society. We have a burgeoning youth bulge across the region, which means that there's a current and a future generation of change makers to be harnessed. And either they are harnessed or they are stifled. And that depends on kind of what policies are in place across the region from our governments. There is definitely wealth across the region, both fiscally and in terms of human resource, which means that there's capital to be deployed. And the trick really is in how we that capital. We have a long-standing tradition of giving in the region, so that means that there's an embedded culture and there's a will to give towards social change. And then there's an increasing awareness and a readiness to implement kind of more cutting edge and an interest from philanthropists and philanthropy organizations to innovate different ways of giving. And one kind of example of that that I can give from firsthand experience is around how the civil society sector and the social sector in Egypt changed from a perspective of necessity driving invention. In 2011, the government in Egypt shut down all of social media, the entire internet, for about 18 days. And people still found a way to navigate around kind of that obstacle and that challenge to still be able to harness local power, people power, get people out on the street. They were still able to motivate and mobilize resources, to get resources to people that needed them, whether it was in hospitals or in homes, etc. So there are ways that kind of Arab philanthropy has innovated out of the need because there's been a stifling of that sector. On the opposite side of the strengths, obviously, we have some of the weaknesses. And what we've noticed in consultation and conversation with many of our members is we've seen kind of a lack of strategic planning that goes beyond the kind of 3 to 5 years, a lack of a forensic accounting of our crises. So that also impacts the mitigation of challenges, which means that often our impact is thwarted. The interventions tend to be short-term, and so therefore sustainability tends to be threatened. And if you look at the geopolitical situation of the region over the last 30 years, there's a very clear reason for why strategic planning doesn't tend to go beyond 5 years, because, look at Egypt. We changed 2 governments in the span of 3 years, 2 entirely different governments in the span of 3 years. So there are reasons for why this is the case. It isn't always the lack of a will, but often reasons that are out of our control. There also tends to be an uneven distribution of wealth, although there's a lot of wealth. And so that means that there are decreased opportunities for collaboration and cooperation, not only with the outside world, but also among Arab donors and across borders. We have a very, very serious lack of data and a very serious lack of knowledge sharing. And so the will to collaborate means that and the will to collaborate is impacted by this lack of data. If we don't know what people are doing, if we don't know where they're doing it, if we don't know how they're doing it, then this impacts our will to collaborate. And so then that further diminishes the potential for real lasting impact. And then finally, there's a weak infrastructure. And that means that there's a lack of support for implementing more of the cutting edge innovations and more innovative means of philanthropic giving and engagement. We have very, very, very weak infrastructure around banking. And whether it's within the region or outside the region, I mean, try to have an Arab foundation or an Arab philanthropist, even Arab family philanthropists, try to open a bank account anywhere in the region or outside of the region. And it's difficult. There's a reputational issue involved. There's a lack of trust between government and the philanthropic sector overall. And I can almost pretty confidently say that's across the 22 countries of the region. Very few countries, Tunisia might be an example, where the civil society sector is gaining more and more respect. Across the rest of the region, there's a lack of trust, and a really serious one. So, we also, I'll wait to talk about kind of our opportunities for the next part of this, and maybe Gaugao and I can have a bit of an exchange about her experience vis-a-vis more specific points of what I've just described. But when there's a lack of accountability, when there's a lack of transparency, it's difficult to form relationships where some of these values might be expected, right? And I'm often kind of aware of making sure that people recognize that the lack of accountability and transparency that exists within Arab philanthropy is not due to a lack of will to be transparent and accountable. In many cases, it's actually dangerous to be accountable and transparent. If you are an organization that is funding human rights, and I mean that literally, just the word human rights, or the two words, is already problematic. You could find yourself in jail. You have to find ways to kind of find a language that is condoned by your government. And so collaborating with other human rights organizations is problematic. If you're doing anything around LGBTQ, if you're doing anything around women's empowerment. So those are considerations that are also very important for people to kind of think about when they looking at fundraising in the region, that the cultural context is very important.
Thank you very much, Naila. That was a very comprehensive explanation of the region and the philanthropic landscape that you face. Gaugao, if I could come back to you and maybe ask you to respond to some of the things that you've heard. And then when you've done that, if you could maybe move into giving us some examples of your fundraising case studies, and we can tease out some of the things that we've already heard as well.
Well, what you saw was me furiously scribbling down notes because I felt like I was learning even after the fact, and really emphatic nodding because the pieces around cultural context and governmental structure and, why would an Asian organization be fundraising from someone from the region? When I think about why someone from Singapore or Japan or from China, why from Hong Kong, why would we want to go fundraise from the Arab region? That motivation, it has to be crystal clear in order for one to want to then navigate through the governmental structures, the challenges of getting money out of the country. The naivety that I think about from when I was fundraising for the region is extraordinary. And that level of complexity just wasn't here. So this is why it's going to be talking about it. It's best practice, right? This is what we need to talk about. How do we set best practice for when an Asian organization, no matter what cultural context they're coming from, then goes into the region and then thinks, I want to talk to this person in the country and I want to get money out because I want it to benefit my organization. What are they thinking about? I alluded to it when I very eagerly went into it at the beginning. But where is the benefit for the donor and the philanthropist if they do fund in this country? Is it a political thing? Is it because you have shared ideals? Even if you had those shared ideals, how do you actually create the mechanisms and best practice so that the funding is reported on sustainably, that you create that data that you talked about, Naila? I can tell you about all the different mistakes that I've made very articulately, and I feel as if everything that you've said about where there are weaknesses, I just went into that very, very blindly with my team. So maybe it's helpful to talk about some of the case studies and sort of see what the lessons learned are there. I have only successfully raised 3 gifts from the region. 2 of them were from the UAE, and then 1 of them was from Saudi Arabia. in reality, all 3 donations, the funds were held outside of the region. They're either in Hong Kong or in Europe or in the UK, which is no longer Europe. And one was for a donation for an exhibition. The funds are in Hong Kong. The other ones were from higher education. So none of them were sort of controversial in those areas that you had talked about, the sort of women's rights, the sort of idea of human rights, the idea of LGBTQ rights. And it makes me realize that if I were coming from slightly more of a contentious or slightly problematic foundation, I wouldn't even be able to get my feet off the ground, essentially, because I can't even fundraise for those kinds of organizations in China, for example. Being homosexual in China was only, sorry, let me start again. Sorry about this. Being homosexual in China only became legal as a status in 2001. The idea that you're fundraising for those kind of rights in China is very controversial, even now. And so the idea that you then go for anything human rights related to the Arab region, where there are also potentially huge political and social implications, would be naive. But the challenge is that you want to co-create solutions where people are going through the same problems and maybe trying to find ways to come out of it. And I think that the lesson learned there would be, instead of asking for the funding, it would be asking for expertise if I were in that situation. One of our exhibitions was around LGBTQ representation in Chinese art, which is why it was a mistake to go to the region for that. But it's something that I can look back with 2020 hindsight that I didn't necessarily have before. The one for higher education was a really interesting donation because it was for research in the region, or in the Arab region, around the study of antiquities, a reparative approach towards that kind of research, where you don't necessarily take a colonial view of it and think this is the way that you should do it, but you co-create history telling, if you will, with researchers in the universities locally to then have narratives that aren't sort of from the outside in, from the inside out. That donation only came around because it came from a donor who was from Saudi Arabia, who was a subject matter expert in the topic. And she felt like it was really important to use the mechanism of an external organization to then bolster the capacity building and the structures within the region itself. But it's based fundamentally in partnership across all of the foundations and the universities involved. It's not something that's sort of come out of her just wanting to give the money and for us to implement it. It's taken a lot of collaboration. It's taken 10 years of joint projects that have happened. Governments sign off at every single point. And so the level of investment that she's put into that donation is sort of coming on the coattails of something that has happened already. It's not starting from nothing. And I think that really is a testament to how much partnership is required to move any kind of philanthropic conversation forward. You have to do the groundwork in advance. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've learned so much from listening to you, Naila. I have to go back to the drawing board on a lot of my thinking.
Thank you very much, Gaga. Naila, I could see you smiling and nodding as I was taking us through her journeys, and I'm sure you have a few comments to respond to that. And then if I could invite you then to talk about some of the opportunities, collaborations and partnerships that you alluded to towards the end of your last piece as well.
It's interesting because we, as a sector, as a network, a lot of the conversations that we keep having have focused quite exclusively on many of the challenges that we've been facing. Okay, and I can't, I can't kind of undermine the level of the challenges that we've faced as a region and as a sector. And I can't underplay them so that it looks like a nice, beautiful, rosy picture. There are, of course, there are exceptions. There are exceptions to some, portions and sectors within the sector, subsectors within the sector that are having success in fundraising. I mean, I think the American universities are across the region are probably not facing the same kind of struggles and obstacles that we face sort of in the larger sector. And that has to do with many different, they're registered in the US, they're 501c3s in many cases, they get support from alumni that are based outside of the region, et cetera, et cetera. There are many different reasons for why that is. But for the most part, the number of challenges that we're facing, not the least of which has to do with this like ever increasingly shrinking space that we barely survive in. We're looking at a sector where the N is being taken out of an NGO, right? So for most NGOs, non-governmental organizations, we don't have the luxury of not being completely having oversight by a government entity. And so, it's a misnomer to say that these are non-governmental organizations, because we're not NGOs in most cases. And in the cases where, there are NGOs that are able to function and are able to, whether it's make grants or receive grants, it's, because they work in places where the government knows it's not going to be able to fill a gap. And so they rely on many of these NGOs to fill those gaps. But again, whatever that gap is that's being filled is not something necessarily controversial. It's, meal delivery, it's education, it's something that's not necessarily going to throw up any red flags. So there's a real danger in that. And I think, when we first, the three of us, Gao, Dave, and I first met, remember our very first conversation was around how I don't personally feel comfortable having a conversation about, oh, look at all the lovely ways that I can tell you how you can come into a meeting with, an Arab philanthropist and ask for money and walk away successful because I'm going to give you the trick and, easy money. I don't feel comfortable doing that because that's not the reality. I am an Arab organization. I myself find it very difficult to get money for institution building. I mean, nothing about what AFF does is in any way controversial. Right? The only controversy is that maybe we don't do enough for our members. And we ourselves have very, very, very serious challenges getting funding from the region. I don't have a single Arab donor. And the AFF has been around since 2006. So it's been around for almost 15 years. It's, that's a very serious consideration. And when a donor or a fundraiser is coming to partner, collaborate, fundraise, whatever it is, have grants made from the region for their own project or organization, whatever that is, that's a very important kind of piece of knowledge to have, right? Before you waste your time getting on a plane and going all the way, or, even scheduling a Zoom call to have a conversation that you think is going to go a certain way, and then realize that those values may not necessarily be aligned with the person that you're speaking with. However, having said all that, there are nuggets of opportunities that have arisen. And I think that it's important to kind of know organically how those opportunities have arisen so that we know how to take advantage of them. And one of the things that I think is worth noting is that in terms of the opportunities, we know that there's an interest among philanthropists in the region to explore new global trends in giving. Okay, we know that. We know that because we see it. We've seen the rise of social enterprise models that have been growing across the region, whether you're looking at Jordan, Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon really, even after, especially after the latest explosions and all these, the government situation and the issues with the government more recently. So we know that allows an opportunity to engage philanthropists across the world in a new way, right? So that is one kind of if you will. We know that there's access to a more global platform. Try to shut it down or not, governments are not able to shut down access to a digital network. So whether it's social media, whatever it is, we know that allows for an ease of sharing of information and kind of exposure to knowledge that we may not necessarily have from within, but are able to access from without. And particularly to kind of a more younger cyber engaged population. And we know that the region has about 50% of its population is under the age of 25. So they are that target. And then there's a shared interest, and this might be a little bit of a controversial thing to point out or to bring up, but there's a shared interest both regionally and globally to combat a current rise in radicalization, right? And so that means that there is an opportunity to collaborate and to engage in ways to provide alternatives for the region's youth. And so again, we go back to the kind of the importance of harnessing that youth for a positive outcome rather than a negative outcome. So rather than disenfranchising Arab youth, which are ultimately literally the future, we can harness that that drive and that passion and whatever that is, and just that youth, just by virtue of its nature, to create more long-term sustainable models of giving and impact. That's a difficult one, but it's also one of the best ways for kind of organizational engagement with Arab philanthropy organizations, because everybody has to have some sort of program that is modeled on supporting Arab youth. We are dealing with this issue in every single country of the region, bar none, every single country. So that's a real opportunity. Where does it go? I mean, I always talk about this trifecta of obstacles: the lack of data, lack of accountability, lack of transparency. And, that is an issue. Those are really very serious issues. But then there's also a way to sort of leverage the aspects of those issues that can be used for something a bit more positive. And one of the things that I think is important, which would go back to Gaogao's reflection on kind of her own experience in the region, is understanding the Arab donor and understanding kind of what are really the critical factors for an enabling engagement, right? Or for a positive engagement. So we have to build trust. We have to build trust between our two, whatever those two regions are, but whatever those two organizations are. Even one organization from, Tunis going to Egypt and the reverse is a similar, has that similar need of building that trust in the organization. We need feelings of distinction, right? So what distincts your particular program, and how does it align with something that I'm already doing as an Arab donor or I'm interested in doing? This idea of a shared value, and I don't want to take the altruism out of the kind of donor behavior, but of course, if a Chinese or other Asian organization is coming to the Arab region looking for funding, we need to be very clear about what is the value of that funding to the funder, right? What is that funder getting out of it? And it doesn't necessarily have to be anything commercial, obviously, but where is that sense of ownership? How does that help that donor in its visibility, in meeting whatever the need of that donor is? And we need to be able to create a feeling of a value to whatever the cause is, even if that cause is just an art gallery or an art exhibition. We need to be able to create that feeling. Fortunately, unfortunately, whatever it is, what it is, there has to be an alignment with government direction. You're not going to find a rogue Arab donor who is in the region, who has any ties to the region, who's going to be able to do something that does not align with whatever government that organization or donor or philanthropist is monitored by. It's impossible, because that's literally just risking jail time at the very least, frozen assets at the very worst, debanking, all of these issues that we've seen many people in our network experience, right? I mean, the Human Rights Fund, which is the Arab Human Rights Fund, the only human rights fund that is organic to the region, shut down 3 years ago, just simply because 1 point something million of its dollars were frozen in their bank in the Netherlands, not even an Arab bank, right? So they had an endowed fund, and one day ABN, the bank, decided that they just were suspicious somehow for whatever reason and just shut them down. And that's tragic. That's a tragedy when the only fund for Arab human rights that is in the region, of the region, for the region, gets shut down. Not even in the region, but of course it's no longer able to function. And so these are very serious threats that we face, which further kind of stresses the alignment with government direction. You have to understand the context of an Arab donor within the region when it comes to visibility versus anonymity. And when you are touting visibility as a value, we have to be very careful about what kind of visibility that is, and have to be sure that that visibility doesn't somehow go against the cultural context of anonymous giving and kind of the value that's placed on anonymity if that giving is coming from a religious place, which oftentimes, even if it isn't coming from that place, it is somehow impacted by that, right? It is impacted by by faith. The frequency of exchange, you know, Arabs culturally, and I mean, this is such a gross generalization, but culturally we are a very communicative culture, and we're extended families, and our extended families go way beyond what is, you know, in the West understood as a nuclear family. So the frequency of exchange is important. That's also important in kind of building that trust, and building an understanding of each other. We're a lot about people and less about an organization. So, you know, oftentimes if we don't know who's behind an organization, the reputation of the organization is irrelevant, frankly, because it really is that person. At the end of the day, that's the person that's going to come into my home. That's the person that's going to come into my office and have a conversation with me about a shared value or a shared interest. And then what is that form of communication? I mean, this is the simplest, kind of most basic. I don't get a lot of feedback from my network on email, frankly. I just don't. Email is kind of cold. I write in English. That's what I'm the most comfortable in. Many of the organizations that I reach out to would really prefer to be communicated to in Arabic. So that's much easier for me to do on the phone. It's much easier for me to do on WhatsApp. I get far more engagement through WhatsApp than I do just by sending out emails. And when I do send out emails, if that email is very personalized, I'll probably get a response a lot quicker than if it looks like I've sent it out to 500 people, right? And that is a key difference. I mean, when I used to work in the US, I don't even think people have WhatsApp in many cases, right? Like a lot of my friends don't even understand what WhatsApp is. So that's a very marked difference in kind of the way that we communicate, and how often we communicate. And then it really is just looking about an engagement with Arab philanthropy. So I think kind of the three takeaways that I would really stress is look at the context, make sure that you understand the context. It really helps to know who you're talking to. It helps to know what have they done in the past. That may not be information that's very easily accessible because we don't have everything put out on our websites. We don't have, everything is not transparent in that way. So it's often, you know, talking to people who know the people that you're trying to connect with, getting an inside track into having an introduction. A platform and a forum like AFF is one very good way to go, because we are connected to everyone in the region, even if they're not part of our membership or part of our network. And, you know, if I, as an Arab, am contacting X in Saudi Arabia to make a connection with someone in Asia or any other country, or any other continent rather, you'll have more luck of having that engagement actually happen, because it's coming from a quote unquote trusted place rather than just cold calling people. So context is key. A collaboration on strategy. You know, Arab donors are still, whether they're strategic or not, I mean, that's irrespective, but are tied to their money, and that money is a reputation. And where that money goes has a lot of reputational risk. So there needs to be sort of a feeling where you are actually collaborating on the strategy of the giving and where it's going, and designing an exit strategy. Because still, even as strategic as Arab philanthropy wants to become, it still has a history of that sort of shorter term, 3 to 5 year. So even if you're designing a collaboration that is meant to be a little bit more long term, it's worth discussing what is the exit strategy, what does it look like, and how can you each contribute as partners to that.
That's very comprehensive, and I think both Gaga and myself, and I'm sure the delegates, have learned a huge amount from that wonderful input already. Gaga, if I can come back to you, and you said quite openly that you went into the region a little blind. As a strategist yourself, what would you now do differently? What would you be contemplating if you were to do that all over again?
First, I'm going to call Naila and hang out with her. What would I do differently? I'd really ask myself if it's the right thing to do, to go into region, guns are blazing, jump on a plane, set up those Zoom calls, use my brand name. Where is the long-term benefit, which is where I think fundraising really needs to be centered on. I would have really interrogated what those shared objectives were, but also I would have armed myself and done the due diligence of How do we get the funding out? How do we give back? What is being asked of here? Chinese philanthropy is increasingly transactional, visibly or non-visibly. And I only speak on specifically around Chinese philanthropy right now, but that culture informs how we then fundraise, the expectations within philanthropy now. I think I would also have a very clear idea of the communication styles that we had used, because what I had done is I'd moved to Beijing at the UCCA, having come from the Serpentine Gallery. And so I had a very sort of British, very sort of glamorous European way of fundraising that I tried to sort of export over to China. And it didn't work. It didn't work in any way at all. Because I was naive. I thought it would work because these were international people who wanted to get engaged in the certain ways. And then I thought people from the Arab region would want to do that too. And they didn't. It wasn't interesting to them. It wasn't collaborative. So if I sort of did that again, I would think about what is the actual structure, as you say, Naila, the context that I need to incorporate into my style of fundraising, the culture that I'm bringing in. The informality that you talk about is not something that's very familiar with me. In China and sometimes in Singapore and Japan also, we're very formal. You have to have meetings, it's emails, it's translated, it's pre-meetings. So many pre-meetings. I've got a written record for everything. I write all my emails in Chinese and English just to make sure there's no nuance lost. I'm surprised I got any money out of the region, to be honest. So these are all things that I would tell myself of what I would think about if I were to do it again.
Thank you both very much for that. What I'd like to touch on now for a few minutes, if I may, is the donor constituents, the different types of donors that you're used to reaching out to, Gawa, and the sort of donor relations, donor stewardship experience that you would be looking to craft and expect. And then, Naila, if you could comment on how that is seen in the MENA region and what your thoughts on that would be, please. Gaga, if you could maybe go first.
The types of donors that we fundraised for were mostly individuals or foundations with a strong sort of individual presence. And so, as opposed to just regular grant giving large portfolio organizations. And so the donor experience had to be quite individualistic, bespoke, tailored for their interests and their needs. And because we were in an art museum, it was quite easy to steward them because it was access to the artists, access to the exhibitions. It did transcend borders, but you could also do it virtually through conversations. And I don't even think it was that particular to being in Asia or in China, because it's a model that we would have used in any other country, I think. What we saw is that people at that time when we could still travel, loved to travel to Hong Kong, to Beijing, to Shanghai to engage with people. And so for them, it was a cultural experience where they could learn about the artist and work and the societal impact. And it was very easy to craft those experiences. I did not take into account, as I have said many times in this conversation, the cultural context of the expectations of what their philanthropy would enable, because I think the thing I was fundraising for was programmatic. I realize this now in this conversation right now. It was programmatic. And so there was a very definitive end date and exit strategy, which hits on your third point, Naila. But is that reflective of the sort of donors that you represent? They're mostly individuals, or they are foundations, corporates?
No, I mean, the network is pretty diverse in terms of what type of philanthropic actor. And, there's also one other sort of definition that is important to understand, that in the Arab region, when you say something is a foundation, so the Arabic word for it is mu'assasa, and a mu'assasa is literally the foundation, a literal foundation of something. So that doesn't actually in the region connote grant making necessarily, okay? So a foundation can be an organization that in any way, shape or form contributes to social good, whether it's a community foundation, whether it's grant maker, it's a grant seeker. Most foundations in the region tend to be a hybrid of the two, and that's kind of like if you take a spectrum of the different types of donors and the different types of foundations in the Arab region, the middle of that spectrum would be these hybrid models. So they are operational in some cases, very heavily funded for programs and activities within certain communities, and sometimes those communities can extend beyond the local geography. But for the most part, they grant make and they grant seek. Okay, and their grant making comes from either sub granting of a larger grant, or a small endowment that is then supplemented by additional grant seeking. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you'd have, like, maybe family philanthropy organizations. There aren't too many of them, but there are enough to make enough of an impact within each country. In most cases, and again, I don't want to generalize, but in most cases, most family foundations in the Arab region are very local, right? So they don't necessarily fund outside of their local boundaries. The rise in corporate foundations and in what has traditionally been called, CSR, and now is kind of moving away more towards becoming embedded as part of the culture of an organization. I mean, I think we're seeing that everywhere, but in the Arab region for sure. The concept of CSR had first started showing in multinational organizations, of which there are plenty, right? So the Pepsis and the P&Gs and those guys, but then more and more local organizations are creating foundational arms of their corporations to serve as what traditionally used to be a CSR, but is now really just kind of embedding this culture of, yes, you may have a profitable business, but you're also interested in ensuring the betterment of a community and a nation building and all of that, and civic engagement in one way or another. And then there are more of the arts and cultures foundations, which would be very familiar to someone coming in from any other part of the world. Foundations that fund arts projects, education projects, culture projects, etc. So, and then universities, obviously. But I think the main distinction in the type of foundation as a structure, as an infrastructure, as an institution, are these hybrid models. And so often I'll say, oh, we have X number of foundations in our membership, and people automatically assume, oh, these are all grant makers. That's not necessarily the case. In most cases, they have the capacity to grant make in one way or another, but it may not necessarily be endowment-based grant making. It may not necessarily be actual funds that they hold themselves. So that's kind of the spectrum of the types of philanthropic actors.
And Naila, what sort of expectations do the foundations that do grant make have from that donor relations stewardship perspective? What can organizations from Asia learn around that?
So, I mean, more and more, I think, because Arab foundations and Arab philanthropy is engaging more and more on a global kind of platform, and in various global platforms. And honestly, I mean, I'll just point one thing out. Like, I don't know how many other Arab speakers or speakers representing the Arab region are doing sessions for IFAB. I know of at least one other, and that's usually more than what you find in any kind of global conversation. So already that's 100% more representation than I'm used to. And so because of that kind of visibility and that level of engagement, there really is an interest more and more for Arab philanthropy to, I don't want to say, because it's not bettering or anything. It's really more professionalizing a little bit more that relationship, right? So we may not necessarily have an expectation of accountability and transparency on our side. And that's not to say, again, that, I mean, if I'm registered in Jordan as a Jordanian branch of a foreign entity, I report to the government every year. I mean, there is accountability in that regard, right? There is that level of transparency. The AFF, for example, is very transparent. Every single one of our audits is online for everyone to see from the day we started. And I mean, in its entirety, not just the summary of our audits. Have we gone the complete transparency route where we share all of our budgets? No, we haven't done that. But if we needed to, we would, if that's kind of the sort of modeling that we'd like to present. And that's on the extreme side of the spectrum in terms of transparency. But the expectation isn't there. It's not like any of my members said, why aren't your audits online? It's more that as a forum, we've been pushing this idea that there is value in being transparent. There is value in sharing your data, because that data allows you not only to represent yourself where you are vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but it also allows you to build more trusting and collaborative relationships, right? Because there's nothing to hide. Literally, there's nothing to hide. And again, to stress, in most cases, almost in all cases, there is nothing to hide. The reason that we're hiding isn't because we have something to be afraid of. It's either that there's no expectation of us sharing it, so why would you? And so that behavior hasn't been kind of modeled for us or expected of us. So in that respect, I think there's a shift in that. The donor relationships are becoming a bit more professionalized. So Arab donors are asking for some form of reporting between them and their grantees. And also because many Arab donors are receivers of foreign grants and foreign donations. So they're already familiar with that process, and are kind of taking the best practice of that process and incorporating into their own practice. And then I just think that sort of that honest communication about what are the expectations on both sides and both ends. And one of the things, which I don't know that this happens, I've never been the recipient of Arab money, so I don't know if that's the case. But I can say, if I were in the seat of a donor, of an Arab donor, what I would, having gleaned experience from having been exclusively on the receiving end of foreign donor money, and having my relationships with foreign donors, non-Arab donors, I would be so cognizant and really hold myself accountable as an Arab donor for the kind of relationship that I build with my grantees, in ensuring that it comes from a place of respecting that grantee's expertise over mine, being very, very careful not to sort of, steamroll over what the needs that have been identified by my grantee are, just to fit some kind of matrix that I have in my head of what I want my money to go to. And having that conversation be very honest, and having that conversation be flexible. I mean, again, the experience that I've had as a network that has taken foreign funding and non-Arab funding is, I started a particular grant in one geopolitical situation, and I ended it in a completely different world. And having a grantor that is unable to be flexible about amending what it's requiring of me is, I mean, not only is it offensive for various reasons, but it's also completely useless. At the end of the day, I'm not delivering something that you've expected of me, but at the same time, what you're expecting of me is useless to me in my context. So I would kind of build that into what it looks like to engage with an Arab donor. And I mean, I say that more, as much for the Arab donor as I do for the person seeking money from the Arab donor.
I have a follow-up question, which is around the gender of the donor. So I've only solicited and successfully got one donation from a female donor from the Arab region, but even philanthropists in Asia are often male. If I were to do this again in the right way, without generalizing, I suppose, across the region, but are there things I need to think about or that you observe as a pattern?
Of course, culturally, it's important to know what is the gender dynamic at play in any situation, right? And in a situation like this, I mean, again, that environment is changing. So 5 years ago, I would have told you, if you're going to Saudi Arabia, unless you're meeting with a female, you're more likely not going to be invited into the room. So you probably don't want to go by yourself as a woman. You may not even get the visa to go by yourself as a woman 5 years ago. Today, that's changing. I mean, it's changing even to our own surprise. Like, I never in my lifetime thought that I would see this kind of progress in a Saudi context. So, but I think it's important to know, for example, as an Arab woman, it's instinctive for me that I don't put out my hand to shake the hand of a male peer unless he puts, I mean, it's actually the other way around. A male Arab will never put his hand out to shake my hand unless I put it out first, right? That's instinctive. I mean, it doesn't need to be said. It's not anything that we will not make that mistake, because in many cases, Arab women, even if they're not covered, even if they're, if they may appear to be completely culturally westernized, will not shake the hand of a man. And the reverse is also true. So it's not something, this is, I don't know that you can teach that. It's one of those things somebody will tell you on the way into a room, like, oh, by the way, this guy is not going to shake your hand, or this woman is not going to shake your hand. I mean, in that regard, there are those sort of dynamics at play. But in terms of, are there more philanthropists that are male in the region? I mean, yes, just by virtue of, again, if you go back to kind of Islam and Islam's impact on money and family money, the way that Islam divides inheritance money is much more in favor of the male than it is for the female. There are various reasons behind that. They don't all necessarily translate to a modern society, but they are respected nonetheless for various reasons. So yeah, you'll most likely find that the decision maker will tend to be a male if it's family money. But most of the foundations that I have on my network that are grant makers, the grant making actors, are run by women, and they are the final decision maker. They are the decision makers on where the endowment is spent, how it's spent, what the programs are. So I mean, I don't think there's a true and fast rule about this, but there are some considerations to bear in mind for sure.
It makes me think that there's so much space, the changes in Saudi Arabia over the past 5 years, there's just so much space for change and innovation. And my experience is dated. I mean, I've said that at the beginning, it's from a bunch of years ago. Things may be so much different for people who are fundraising from Asian organizations now and in the next 5 years and the years after. So I think there is always space for philanthropy to change and to be shaped by that. I realize it's a very touchy subject. I probably shouldn't have asked it. But
no, it's fine. Why not?
Well, I mean, it drives why you would go out there in the first place, because if you want to talk about women's rights, we want to fundraise for human rights or for whatever, it is something that you have to think about as 101. And it's not something that I thought about as 101 when I went into the region. So I really appreciate your willingness to answer that question.
I think we're closing on to the time for the end of this session, and I'm sure you're going to both have lots of questions from the delegates when we have the opportunity for those questions to be posted. So I'd anticipate a lot for you to do in the next part of the sessions as well. But what I would like to do is thank you both very much for giving your time, for timing your thought in putting your presentations together. And I'm sure the delegates will find this a very informative and enlightening topic. So thank you both very much.